Good afternoon. I'm David Wendler from the Department of Bioethics here at the NIH Clinical Center. And today I'm going to talk, and hopefully we're going to have some time for discussion on the ethical issues that are raised in conducting research with what are called vulnerable subjects. And I'll talk a minute on what I mean by that. Just a couple of notes. I work at the NIH. I work here in the Clinical Center, but I am emphatically not a spokesperson for the NIH. What I say are going to be my own views. They're based on my own thoughts, and as you'll see, in some cases, my own research. I hope people here agree with me on some of this, but if we're really lucky, people will disagree on some, which will give us a chance to have a good discussion. All right, so research with vulnerable subjects. Everybody who's here, everybody who's watching online knows the importance of conducting clinical research. It's not the only way, but it's certainly one of the best and one of the primary ways for identifying new treatments, new interventions, new ways to keep people from getting sick, cure people who are sick, and treat people who are chronically ill. In order to preserve clinical research, continue to do it, keep public trust in it, protect subjects, it's important that we have sufficient protections in place for the people who participate in research. And the point of today's lecture is this is especially important with vulnerable subjects. And this is a topic that's not new. This is not a claim that's original to me. Regulations, commentators, and guidelines for at least the last 40 years or so have been emphasizing the importance of protecting vulnerable subjects who participate in clinical research. This is just one blurb, one example of that from the US regulations, which says that IRBs, so review committees, should be aware of the special problems of research involving vulnerable populations, and then should try to develop ways, additional protections, additional safeguards to protect vulnerable subjects. So that raises three obvious questions that I'm going to talk about a little bit today. One, who's vulnerable, or which subjects are vulnerable? What are the challenges that are raised when we try to conduct research with vulnerable subjects, and what additional requirements, protections, or safeguards can we put in place to try to address those concerns? So I'm going to try to briefly go through each of these questions. I'll talk a little bit initially on some background regarding the debate over who's a vulnerable subject, how you define vulnerable subjects, and then I'm just going to hone in on one, I think a very important example, but one example of research with a vulnerable population in order to provide some insight into what those concerns that get raised, and then what are some protections that can be put in place to try to address those concerns. So vulnerability, if you just think about it very generally, so Merriam-Webster says that vulnerable individuals are those who are capable of being wounded, they're open to damage, or they're assailable, which I think is an absolutely wonderful word. So a vulnerable individual is any individual who can be harmed, who can be hurt, who can be damaged, who can be wounded. So if you think about that for a second, it's not hard to think of examples of individuals who can be harmed, hurt, or wounded, right? That's easy to do. What's actually hard is to think about who doesn't fit this definition. What individual isn't capable of being wounded or open to damage? And that raises one of the first challenges and one of the debates that's going on right now in thinking about research with vulnerable subjects, which is, if you think of vulnerable subjects as somebody who's capable of being harmed, damaged, or wounded, and then you think about humans, presumably one of the fundamental aspects of the human predicament is the fact that we're all capable of being harmed, damaged, or wounded. We can experience disease. Someone can cause us to suffer pain, loneliness, rejection. We can die. We can be killed. So there are just myriad ways in which all of us can be harmed or damaged. So this seems to suggest then, if we take the definition of vulnerability seriously, that everybody is vulnerable. And if all human subjects are human, it follows, according to some pretty basic logic, that all human subjects are vulnerable. So if all human subjects are vulnerable, then what does it mean, or how does it make sense to think about extra protections for vulnerable subjects if, in fact, everybody's vulnerable? Here's one example of that. One of the complaints people have been making over the last decade or so in research ethics is that lists of vulnerable subjects just keep growing longer and longer. This is an example. CIOMS is the Council of the International Organization of Medical Sciences. It is a very prominent and influential set of guidelines for human subjects research, particularly human subjects research that's conducted in developing countries. And here is a non-exhaustive list from them of subjects who are vulnerable. And as you just think about it, you can look through a couple of the examples. This is an awfully long list. And this isn't even a complete list. And then the question becomes, obviously, if all of these people and even more are vulnerable, then how is it that we can come up with protections and safeguards for vulnerable subjects? So this is the concern. What sense does it make to try to institute special protections for vulnerable subjects if almost everybody's vulnerable? This is a quote from a review about 10 years ago on the issue of vulnerability in research by Carol Levine. Also, Christine Grady, who talked here a couple of weeks ago, was on this paper. And they point out that if everybody's vulnerable, then it seems as though the concept becomes too nebulous to be meaningful. So there's this problem. It looks like if you look at things like standard definitions of vulnerability, everybody's vulnerable. But then if everybody's vulnerable, how is it that you can implement additional protections for vulnerable subjects? Doesn't that just mean that everybody needs additional protections? And if everybody's vulnerable, then it seems as, in a sense, that nobody is. So what do we make of this? So here's one way for me that I try to explain this. It's to think about two different kinds of claims that we can make when we talk about vulnerability, either in general or with respect to human subjects research. And the first one is what I call categorical claims. So it's a claim that all of the individuals in some group, some set, some population are vulnerable. That's a categorical claim. And then a comparative claim, which is that some individuals within a group, class, or set are more vulnerable than other individuals within that group, class, or set. So here are some just basic examples. Categorical claim, all cars are at risk of being stolen. That seems pretty clear. Just about every car is at least in a position where somebody might steal it. That talks about all cars, right? Now here's a comparative claim. At least according to data from last year, I assume this is still true, that Hondas, at least in the US, are the most stolen car. So it looks like Hondas are at increased risk of being stolen. And what this suggests then, if whenever we're talking about vulnerability, the first thing we need to know is whether or not we're talking about a categorical claim, all individuals, like all human beings, are vulnerable, or are we talking about a comparative claim? Some set of human beings, or say research subjects, are more vulnerable than other set or individuals or research subjects. So what do you do with categorical claims? So the fact that everybody's vulnerable, the fact that everybody can be harmed, the fact that human subjects, all human subjects, can be harmed, isn't necessarily meaningless. It makes the point that what we need protections for all research participants, no matter who they are and no matter where they participate in research. This is a point that was made by Fred Grinnell, who's works in research ethics from Texas. And basically what he argues is once you take seriously the fact that all human subjects are vulnerable, what we need is a new framework for thinking about how to protect subjects. And in particular, he talks about a kind of precautionary principle, which is a principle that gets derived from thinking about protection of the environment, which is basically that you're trying to be very careful in terms of the risks that you're willing to accept in a particular activity or an enterprise. And Fred's thought is, given the fact that everybody is vulnerable, all human subjects are vulnerable, maybe this is the kind of approach we should take to research ethics as well. So we can talk about it if people are interested. I'm not necessarily advocating this view. My point is just that the categorical claim, all subjects are vulnerable, can make sense to the extent that what you're trying to figure out is what should be the regulations or the protections for everybody who participates in clinical research. So that's all regulations as part of a categorical claim. Now there's the comparative claim. So what do the comparative claims do? So as I mentioned, comparative claims are picking out specific groups who are especially or more vulnerable or at increased risk of being vulnerable. And here the suggestion is that once you've got general protections in place for all subjects, then the question is, are those protections sufficient for all the different groups that might enroll in your research? If the answer is yes, great, you're set. But if not, then it suggests that there are comparatively vulnerable subjects who might need additional protections. And that's where the call for additional protections comes in. So one of the groups that's famously started some of this was the National Commission, which was one of the first groups in the US, at least, to think about regulations for human subjects research. And they started out with some recommendations for human subjects research in general. And then once they had developed those, they then stopped and said, okay, are they good enough for all types of research? Or are there some categories of research or categories of subjects who need even greater or additional protections? And their answer was yes in a couple cases. And one of the examples for them was children, where children might need even more protections than we give to competent adults. So that's the distinction between comparative claims here and then the prior categorical claims. So one example of this is a nice example. This is one of the most influential papers, I think, that's been written on vulnerability in human subjects research by Ken Kipnis, who's at Hawaii. And basically he says this. He says, when I'm talking about vulnerable subjects, what I mean is I assume that the basic baseline guidelines, regulations, protections are in place and they're working. And then what I'm going to ask is, are there groups or are there individuals for whom that general set of guidelines or protections isn't sufficient so that we need even extra added safeguards or protections going beyond what he calls that baseline of regulations? These are a couple of examples. So DOH is the Declaration of Helsinki. That's one of the most influential set of guidelines on human subjects research. And here they're giving a comparative claim. Some research populations are particularly vulnerable. So they're not talking about all human subjects. Maybe they're granting that all human subjects are vulnerable to a certain extent. Then they're saying, well, some populations are even more vulnerable than that baseline, and they need extra or special protections. And a similar comment from SEOMS that I mentioned just a minute ago. So here's some comparative examples. So the US regulations, based on the suggestions made by the National Commission that I mentioned a minute ago, the US regulations are based on the National Commission's recommendations. And the US decided there's a couple of important populations who need additional or special protections. Prisoners is one of them. Children, as I mentioned, is another. And one of the extra protections here is there are stricter limits on the risks to which you can expose children. So the idea is, well, we need some protections for research with competent adults, but as long as they're competent, as long as they understand, as long as they give informed consent, then maybe we can allow them to accept or be exposed to a higher level of risk in the context of clinical research. But now we start talking about younger children or infants, given that they can't give informed consent, those general protections aren't going to be enough, and we want some additional limits on the extent to which we can expose children to risks in the context of clinical research. So here's a crucial point, and hopefully somebody here will ask me if this doesn't make sense, but when we're talking about these comparative claims, more vulnerable, somebody more vulnerable than else, children are more vulnerable than competent adults, Hondas are more vulnerable than other cars of being stolen. If you think about those claims for a minute, what you'll realize is that they tend to be context dependent, meaning whether or not some group, population, or set of individuals is more vulnerable than others is going to depend upon the context. So when it comes to research, it's going to depend upon the type of research, where it's conducted, and how it's conducted. This is just one simple example based on my earlier case of cars. It turns out that in certain towns in the west of the US, Hondas actually aren't very susceptible to being stolen at all. People aren't interested in them. They're interested in SUVs and trucks. So if you've got a Honda and you're driving in Washington, D.C., it's probably more likely to be stolen than other cars. You might want to take more protections. If you live in one of these towns in the West, you probably don't need to be as concerned. So the context affects whether or not that car is more likely to be stolen. So I had threatened people here that there are going to be a couple quiz questions. Here comes the first one. Context dependent applied to clinical research. Maki works in a lab at the NIH. He's been working with clinical investigators doing both translational science and basic science for at least 15 years. One day she's walking through the halls here at the clinical center where there are often ads up for clinical studies. She sees an ad and she's interested in enrolling in a study. Is Maki a vulnerable subject? According to CIOM, she is? How come? Because she's an employee. So why would being an employee, or why might being an employee make her vulnerable, or more vulnerable, comparatively vulnerable?
Like they feel obligated to be in this study because the PI has some kind of influence over.
Yeah. Okay, so sorry. So there's lots and lots of people listening online. If you can come up to the microphone, that'd be great. Otherwise, I'll just repeat for people. So basically, her point here is, if you remember the list from CIOMS, employees are one of the examples of vulnerable subjects, or what I'm calling comparatively or especially vulnerable subjects. And then my question was, well, why would they be on that list? And your nice response is, well, it might be that given that she's an employee at the NIH, Maki feels some compulsion to say yes and be in a study. So take an obvious example. Imagine that this is a study that's being run by her lab chief. Imagine her lab chief is the principal investigator of this study, and now you want to enroll Maki in that study. You're going to be worried. You might be worried, is she able to say no, given that the person who's in charge, who wants to complete this study, presumably is somebody who has power over her. And that is a very nice example. And it turns out at the clinical center, at least, we have a very specific policy for doing research with employees where there sometimes need to be an independent assessment just exactly to address that concern. So on the one hand, if the PI is her boss, you think she's going to be vulnerable. But on the other hand, imagine she doesn't know any of the people who are doing this research. You might think in that case, she might be less vulnerable than almost anybody else. She really understands this stuff, right? She's been doing and involved in clinical research for 15 years. She might be better able to assess its value, its risks, its potential benefits than somebody who doesn't have that background. So this is just a nice example, I think, of how whether or not a person or a group of people, say in this case employees, whether vulnerable is going to depend on the context that we're talking about. So those lists aren't going to apply broadly. It's going to depend on the case in question. Okay, so that's a discussion of who's vulnerable. So the second question was, so what protections are appropriate for vulnerable subjects? And as I said, given that vulnerability is going to be context dependent, whether or not somebody needs protections, and moreover, what those protections need to be, is going to depend upon that context. So this is exactly your point. If the PI is her boss, then we need to make sure that Maki's able to make not necessarily an informed decision, she probably understands, but we need to make sure she's able to make a voluntary decision, that her boss isn't coercing her, manipulating her, or forcing her to be in the study. Whereas as an infant, that's not what you're worried about. You're worried that infants can't understand. So there you're going to focus more on understanding rather than the voluntariness of the decision the person makes. So here's just a couple examples of applying the vulnerabilities and the safeguards. So employees, as I mentioned, what we do is we do an independent assessment to make sure the person understands and they're making their own decision voluntarily. In the case of children, you're worried they don't understand. They can't look out for their best interest. You want their parents typically to help them. Or you have somebody who doesn't speak English. Well, if they speak French and they're enrolling in a study in Paris, they're in good shape. If they're speaking only French and they're enrolling in a study at the clinical center, that might be a problem. They might not understand as well as other people. You might need a translator. So very different contexts, very different vulnerabilities, and very different protections depending upon the context and the particular vulnerability. Okay, so that's sort of the background I had promised on vulnerability in general, and then talking a little bit about the different types, the categorical and comparative claims regarding vulnerability. Now what I want to do is to think more about protections. I want to think about a very specific case, which is with regard to informed consent, people who can't give informed consent. And the reason why I've picked this one amongst all the vulnerabilities that we've talked about so far is that informed consent is one of the most important protections. It's one of the most common, it's one of the most important. It's not the only one. As Christine mentioned to you, there are a number of very important ones. Independent review is very important. But informed consent is common and it's important. And therefore, when we're doing research with individuals who can't give informed consent, we have a particularly vulnerable case. But again, there's context dependence here as well. There's some research studies for which you don't even require informed consent. And if you don't require informed consent, then the fact that somebody can't give informed consent might not make them vulnerable because you don't even think you need informed consent in that case. So again, even for this one, even though it's very important, you still see that there's some context dependence, some cases in which even maybe being unable to give informed consent doesn't necessarily make a subject vulnerable. All right, so here's a quick example. This is a case I was involved in about 10 years ago. This is one of my favorite examples for thinking about this. This was a woman who was a very educated, intelligent, but now retired government worker who was brought to the NIH for evaluation of her memory by her husband. Her husband reports over the last couple of months that things that she had seemed very capable of doing her entire life. They'd been married for 40 years. She was no longer able to do with facility, and in some cases she wasn't able to do it at all. And he started getting worried about her. So it turned out that there was a team here that was doing a 3-week inpatient evaluation. Basically, this was a group of geriatric psychiatrists who were looking at various kinds of memory problems in the elderly, various kinds of dementia. And what they did was they brought people in, had them in-house for 3 weeks, and did a number of different procedures and tests with them. So MRI is MRI scans, right? LP is lumbar punctures. Basically, you put a needle into the spinal column down in the back, try to get some cerebral spinal fluid to look at what's going on in the fluid that's bathing the person's brain. There's some blood studies, some psychological studies, and behavioral testing. A lot of tests being done on computers, reaction time, memory, and things like that. So that's basically what the goals were in the procedures of the study. At baseline, Ms. P wasn't sure where she was. She wasn't sure when it was. MMSE is her mini mental status exam. It's an exam of basic cognitive function, and 11 is not very good. It goes up to 30. Even on a bad day, I get a 25. On a really bad day, you probably get at least a 20. 11 means somebody's having fundamental problems with a number of different areas of their cognition. So I actually talked to Ms. P. The team was worried about her and wondered whether or not it'd be appropriate to enroll her in a study. So they asked me to talk to her. So I explained that she was being invited to participate in a research study. And one of the things that's always most important to me, particularly in a case like this where it's largely what I call non-beneficial research. This wasn't research that was going to directly benefit Ms. P. These weren't procedures. They weren't doing the blood studies. They weren't doing the MRI to try to clinically help her. It was to try to collect data for longer-term research studies. So I explained to her a number of ways, a number of different times, that this research wasn't intended to benefit her at all. It was a matter of her undergoing these procedures to try to help them learn more that hopefully would help us in the future. So I asked her, and then I said, well, what do you think about this? She looked at me. She was smiling. She was very pleasant. She was engaged. And she said, yeah, of course I want to be in this study. This is just such a lovely place. Now, it's more indication of Ms. P's mental status at the time. This was a standard clinical room with some really, I thought, kind of ugly posters on the wall. And the fact that she thought it was pretty probably was worrisome. And of course, that doesn't seem like the reason why you want somebody to make a decision to be in research or not. And presumably what was going on here, as happens with a lot of people like this, she was just deflecting. She didn't understand the study. She didn't necessarily want to reveal that to me, so she was just turning her attention to something else, the paintings that are actually on the wall behind me that she was able to talk about. So I was confident no one was forcing her to do this. It was up to her, and she was saying yes, but it was clear that she didn't understand. She understood some things, but just very minimally. She didn't understand the vast majority of the study. She certainly didn't understand that the procedures were being done to collect data to help patients in the future. So here's a case in a context in which informed consent isn't going to get us the protections we want simply because this subject can't understand what she needs to understand to give informed consent. So what do we do about that? So quick background on the U.S. regulations. As I mentioned, U.S. regulations, there's what's called Subpart A, the general protections for research. Those largely focus on two things, informed consent and IRB review. And then there are subparts for extra protections for vulnerable subjects, B, C, and D. And those apply to these categories I have here. The first one is pregnant women, fetuses, and neonates. The next one is prisoners. And the third one is children. So the important point for today's purposes right now is that there's no additional protections for people like Ms. P. There's no additional protections for non-emergency research with adults who can't give informed consent beyond getting the permission or the agreement of an appropriate surrogate, what's called in the regulations a legally authorized representative, or an LAR. So a couple things about how we handle cases like this. The first thing is, this is the buzzword in doing evaluations of consent, which is task specificity. And the idea here is that whether or not somebody can understand something and give consent to it obviously depends upon what that thing is. Some of us can understand certain things, and we can't understand other things. So the first point of that is that although things like a mini mental status exam and IQ test, general tests of cognition can be valuable in certain settings, typically they're not going to tell us whether or not somebody can consent to a specific study. The way we figure out whether or not somebody can consent to a specific study is we explain that study to them and see if they can understand that particular study. That's the task specificity of it. And there are at least two ways in which somebody might not be able to give informed consent. They might not be able to understand. That was the challenge with Ms. P. Or they might not be able to give a voluntary decision. That was the challenge, remember, a minute ago with Maki, who worked in the lab. It was a worry about whether or not, if the PI was her boss, whether or not that would undermine her ability to make a voluntary decision whether to enroll. So different axes here that we need to pay attention to. Another point is in terms of timing. Typically, when you hear talks like this, people focus on initial enrollment, the point at which the person first enters a study. That makes sense. That's an important point. But it's also useful to remember that somebody might be able to give informed consent initially, and then they might lose consent capacity for various reasons. They have dementia that progresses. They get an acute episode. They get drugs that make them paranoid for a moment, various reasons why they might lose capacity after they've already enrolled. So one of the examples here is high-dose steroids, which can lead to temporary decisional incapacity, at least in some people. So what do you do? How do investigators handle this? So the idea is what you're supposed to do is empower yourself, empower your team, everybody you work with, to be sensitized to whether or not the people who are being considered and the people who are being enrolled, and, as I just mentioned, the people who are already participating, whether they understand, whether they continue to understand, and they continue to make a voluntary choice about being in the study. And then when there's worries, that person can be evaluated either by the team or, if need be, independently. A number of instruments have been developed. I did a review of this a little while ago, about 10 years ago, for different instruments to evaluate understanding. There's some formal instruments. There are what I call post-consent quizzes, where you just describe the study to the person and then quiz them afterwards. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. So different ways you can evaluate understanding. Voluntariness is harder. There aren't as many instruments that have been developed. There are no formal instruments that I know about. Paul Applebaum, who is a psychiatrist who's now at Columbia, has done some of the best work on this, thinking about how do we evaluate voluntariness in the context of both clinical care and also clinical research. So absent a formal instrument or a formal test, here's one of the ways we try to do it. Is so you just try to ask people and try to get some description from them of what their thinking process is, what the reasons are, what the factors that they regard as impinging on their decision to enroll. You can just ask them, why do they want to be in the study? What makes them think that this would be a good idea? What do they think that other people think about being in the study? What do they think the doctors would do if they said no, they didn't want to be in the study? What do they think their family would do if they said they didn't want to be in the study? So asking a number of questions in various ways to try to see whether or not there are any inappropriate pressures being placed by others on this person to make a decision either to enroll or not to enroll in the study. So here's a sample quiz. I'm on the IRB for the National Institute of Drug Abuse, and what our IRB does is we require for every study that we approve, there has to be a post-consent evaluation to ensure that the people who enroll in our studies understand them and are making a decision based on that understanding. This is just a kind of example of the sorts of quizzes that people get asked. What will happen to you if you decide to be in this study? What are the risks? What would happen if you decide you didn't want to be in the study? So do they realize that they won't face any penalties if they decide not to? What are the chances of benefit? Do they have a realistic appreciation for the chances of benefit? Alternatives are always crucial to make sure somebody understands what alternatives they have to being in a study, and then to try to get a sense for the decision making, which we're not going to talk about that much today. You just ask them, okay, so you have these other alternatives. You could go home, you could go see a clinical doctor, you could get surgery. Why is it that you're interested in enrolling in this study rather than doing one or more of those other things, and get the person to talk their way through it to get a sense for how they're reasoning and how they're making this decision. So now we've evaluated this person, and with Ms. P, she clearly was not able to give informed consent because she was not able, as I mentioned, to understand enough. So what do we do with people like that? How do we protect them? Clearly then she's a vulnerable population, given, as I mentioned, the importance of informed consent. Here's the Nuremberg Code, one of the most influential codes in the history of clinical research. First principle, informed consent is, quote, absolutely essential to ethical research. Well, if you take that seriously, that seems to suggest that if a person can't give informed consent, they shouldn't be in research at all. And what we do then is we say, okay, with people like Ms. P, the way we're going to protect them is we're just going to exclude them from all studies, no matter what type of study it is. This obviously offers very important protection from being harmed, being exploited, or being taken advantage of in the context of clinical research. But it also raises a concern. If we exclude everybody like Ms. P from research, if we exclude every 4-year-old from research, if we exclude every unconscious person from research, it's going to make it very hard, if not impossible, to develop improved treatments, medicines, interventions for those individuals and for those groups. And what that leads to is then a balance. We need to see, can we figure out a way to get sufficient protection for individuals like Ms. P without absolutely categorically prohibiting research with her, so that we can at least make some progress on the kinds of conditions that lead to these cognitive impairments in the first place. All right, that's the challenge. Here's one way to think about the challenge. One way to think about the challenge, why are we worried about Ms. P? Here's one way to think about it. The worry is she now has some process going on in her brain, and that process is making it very difficult for her to understand important aspects of our study. And the worry is we don't want it to be the case that she enrolls in the study because that process is clouding her judgment. We don't want to take advantage of the fact that she doesn't understand. Now, if that's the right way to think about the worry, I think that is the right way to think about the worry. We can talk about it if people see other worries, but for me, that's the primary worry. We don't want to take advantage of or exploit her lack of understanding. So how do you do that? Well, what you want to make sure is you want to make sure that enrollment is consistent with her preferences and values. So, excuse me, even if she could understand, what would she say then? Imagine that. And if the answer is, even if she could understand, she'd say yes, then we can be at least relatively confident we're not taking advantage of her inability to understand. That raises this question. One of the things I try to do here is try to identify places where coming up with empirical data would be helpful to identifying, evaluating, and resolving some of the ethical issues we face in clinical research. So here, we're worried about what I'm calling unwanted enrollment. Enrolling people in research they wouldn't have wanted to enroll in if they'd been able to make their own decisions. One way to try to get a grasp on that is to ask the question and collect data on what do people think about enrolling in research if they become incapacitated. Is it something people are willing to do, not willing to do? So here's a couple studies I'll give you. This is a study we did about 12 years ago with some investigators here, and these were people who were at risk for Alzheimer's disease. So basically, these were first-degree family members of people who had been diagnosed with probable Alzheimer's disease, an important group for thinking about future cognitive impairment in research. And what we found out is that, at least in this group was pretty motivated. A lot of them were willing to be in research, even if they lost the ability to make their own decisions. Another example, this was a follow-up I did with a summer student we had here, and this was looking not at hypotheticals. This wasn't what people indicated in a hypothetical questionnaire. This was actually the choices that people indicated on their advanced directives that they filled out here at the clinical center. And what we found out is some people said, I don't want to be in research. And these are people who come here who tend to be pretty motivated with respect to enrolling in research. So that's important. Some people, even motivated people, don't want to be in research if they become unable to make their own decisions. But a lot of other people did. If the research was minimal risk, a lot of people were willing. If it was more than minimal risk, not as many, but still some people willing to be in the studies. These were data that were confirmed about 5 years ago by my now colleague Scott Kim, who's a psychiatrist, and he was doing a follow-up from a survey of older Americans, and this is a subsample of the survey. And basically what he found, here are the numbers, that, again, a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people are willing to be in research even if they lose the ability to give informed consent. And as the prior studies suggested, not surprisingly, the willingness to be in research if you lose capacity, that willingness goes down as the risks go up and goes down as the potential benefits go down, as you would expect it. As the risk-benefit profile becomes less favorable, people are less willing. As it becomes less risky, people are more willing. So that's what this suggests. It suggests that there's this tracking between the type of research. People don't have categorical views. Some are willing to be in no research. Very few are willing to be in almost anything. But most people are tracking the risk-benefit and the value of the particular studies. So then the question is, okay, if that's general willingness across at least the US population, this is just data from the US, I should mention, what does that mean about how we can implement safeguards, this challenge I mentioned of trying to figure out safeguards we can implement to allow this research but conduct it in an ethically appropriate way? I'm happy to say that as far as I can tell, if any of the thousands of people who watch this online have other examples, I'd be very interested in hearing about them. As far as I can tell, the Clinical Center was one of the very first institutions in the US and probably in the world to develop a policy on research with adults who can't give informed consent. We call it 87-4. It's when it started in 1987-4. That's the number for it. And that policy has been revised a number of times. And basically what that policy aims to do, it aims to implement 4 important safeguards for research with individuals like Ms. P, adults who can't give informed consent. First is what you might call the compelling reason or the necessity requirement. And here the idea is that if you can do your research just as well with people who can give informed consent, then don't enroll people who can't give informed consent. If those investigators could have done their research equally well with people with consent, they shouldn't enroll Ms. P. Only enroll Ms. P, only enroll a 3-year-old, only enroll somebody who's unconscious when you have to enroll people from that population in order to answer an important scientific question. The way our policy puts that is the IRB has to document that there's a compelling reason to enroll individuals who can't give informed consent, adults in this case who can't give informed consent. Surrogate decision maker. If you're going to have somebody and enroll them, you have a compelling reason to enroll them for an important scientific reason, and they can't make their own decisions about whether or not to be in research, you should have somebody else who decides whether or not they're in research. Again, the buzz term for this in the US regulations is a legally authorized representative or an LAR. I'll just call them a surrogate decision maker for today. So you want somebody else who decides for that person. And the crucial point is that surrogates aren't supposed to be asking whether or not I want. Ms. P's husband's not supposed to say, do I want her in the study? Ms. P's husband is supposed to say, would she want to be in the study? It's the test that I mentioned before of if she were able to make her own decisions, what would she say? And that's sometimes described as a substituted judgment standard. If Ms. P could make this decision for herself, what would she say? And if we're confident she would say yes, then that provides us good reason to think, again, we're not taking advantage of or exploiting her inability to understand herself. If she would say no, then that's a pretty compelling reason not to enroll her in the study. unfortunately, there'll be a lot of cases where you're not sure what the answer to that question is. Then typically what we're supposed to do as the best interest standard is just figure out what would be best for this particular person. So here's the way our policy does it. It's the substitute judgment. It says the surrogate who enrolls, compelling reason, and then needs a surrogate, and the surrogate should have sufficient reason to believe participation in the study is consistent with the individual's preferences and values. So you might ask things like, have you talked to her about ever being in research? Do you think this is the kind of thing she would want to do? Why do you think she would want to be in this study? Why do you think she would be willing to undergo, say, a lumbar puncture in order for investigators to collect data that might help other patients with dementia? So I mentioned task specificity before. So one important thing about this, that was task specificity with respect to understanding a particular study. Here the point is that it's possible that somebody can't give informed consent for a study, but nonetheless they retain the capacity to assign a surrogate to make decisions for them. So I think that probably was the case with Ms. P. She couldn't possibly understand that research study, but she recognized her husband. She knew who her husband was. She trusted her husband. She trusted her husband to make medical decisions for her. She trusted her husband to decide how her life went. This is another nice study by Scott Kim that I mentioned. And according to their data, about a little more than a third of people who were deemed not able to consent for themselves were able to identify and name a surrogate, somebody else to make decisions for them. So again, the important point is the fact that somebody can't consent doesn't mean that they can't make any decisions, and you just have to pick somebody for them. It might be that they can pick a surrogate for themselves. Okay, so there's the first two protections, compelling reason and surrogate. The third one, and this is taken from pediatric regulations, assent and dissent. And basically the idea here is that even if a person can't fully understand to make an independent, autonomous decision, it doesn't mean we should just ignore them and not care about what they want to do. And that's respected by the assent and dissent requirements. The idea here is that you should still explain the study and what's going to happen to the extent the person can understand it and solicit their affirmative agreement, their willingness to be in it. And if somebody dissents, that should be respected. This is a nice paper by Betty Black and some of her colleagues at Hopkins on this a couple of years ago. Here's one of the real challenges, particularly when you start thinking about people who can't give informed consent. They don't fully understand, and they don't always communicate clearly, and it's not always obvious when they're doing something, whether what they're doing is an expression of dissent. So you imagine somebody who just pulls their arm away when you want to do a blood draw. Does that mean they don't want the blood draw? Or does that mean they don't want to be in research? Or does that mean they don't understand what you're doing? Or does that just mean they're worried, that they're scared, and there's maybe something you could do to try to reassure them? So what I try to tell people here in cases like this, you get some maybe unclear sign, is to stop, evaluate it, see what's going on, and then see if there's something that you can do to address it. So maybe just the person was surprised that you grabbed their arm, so they just need to have it explained. Maybe they just need a break. Maybe they're just nervous and you need to explain what's happening. In a lot of cases, by working through it, you can figure out what's going on and address their concerns. Okay, last safeguard is a risk-benefit evaluation. And here the assumption is, well, here I'll give you the background to this, is people can think about this. This is a bonus quiz question, is at least in the US regulations, there are no risk limits on research studies with adults who can give informed consent. Now, that doesn't mean these studies are going to be approved, but at least in principle, the regulations don't block IRBs for approving studies that offer no chance of benefit and have relatively high risk, if the subjects are competent and give voluntary and informed consent. Now, when we talk about people who can't give informed consent, there's almost unanimous agreement that even if that standard is appropriate for competent adults, no upper threshold on risks, when we go to people who can't give informed consent, such as adults like Ms. P, we shouldn't have that kind of allowance. We should have much stricter limits on the level of risks that these people can be exposed to. Talk about this. Basically, the way it's done right now is roughly the idea that either the risks have to be low or there has to be a compensating potential for benefit. So the risks are justified by a potential for benefit. And then, of course, that raises the challenge here of what we need then, and this is a further challenge for people who work in research ethics, is to develop a systematic framework to help people make these judgments, to figure out what the risks are, what the potential benefits are, to what extent do or don't the potential benefits justify the risk. So to give you that example, remember the study with Ms. P. Do people remember what the procedures were? Is anybody's short-term memory functioning? You remember? MRI, behavioral testing, computer testing, so a lumbar puncture. All right, so here's the standard. You should only do research with somebody like Ms. P. It's not going to help her, so either it has to help her, this research isn't going to help her, or the risks have to be sufficiently low. And then the question, if I put you guys IRB hats on, the question would be whether or not the risks of that study are sufficiently low that it's acceptable to do in somebody who can't give informed consent. Is it okay to have them do an MRI? Okay to have them do an LP? Okay to have them do blood draws? And then, of course, is it okay to have them exposed to the risks of all of those things in the context of a single study? All right, threatened part of the lecture, quizzes. So I'm actually going to, here's what we'll do. I'm going to have to talk about one of them before you guys are allowed to leave here. So I'll give you 3 quiz questions, and we can see if there's one that strikes anybody's fancy. I can pick one. So here's number 1. So as I mentioned, remember the compelling justification. The compelling justification says you shouldn't enroll individuals who can't give informed consent when you can conduct the research equally well with people who can give informed consent. That's the compelling justification requirement. Now, here's the question. What counts as a compelling justification? What if you're the IRB and the investigator says, I don't need to enroll this person who can't give informed consent. I could do my study with people who can give informed consent, but this is a very promising drug, and this might help this person. So imagine now you've got somebody who has cognitive impairment. They can't give informed consent. They have diabetes, and now here's a potentially very promising drug for diabetes. What would you say in terms of enrolling them? And I can tell you this is a very lively debate. We actually debate this in our department. It seems, at least on the face of it, you could say one of 2 things. You could say, well, if it really has a chance to help her, why would you exclude the person just because they can't give informed consent? That almost seems like turning protection into a kind of discrimination. If it really has potential benefit, we should let the person enroll. On the other hand, you might say, no, this is research. We can never be sure. There's always risks. We can collect the data from people who can give informed consent. Informed consent's a crucial safeguard. We shouldn't enroll people who can't give informed consent when we can do the research with people who can give informed consent. And I can tell you those are both widely endorsed views, both in our department here and also in the literature. All right, that's quiz question number 1. Quiz question number 2. Imagine a study. I can give you a couple examples of these. We do conferences around the world on research ethics, and we were in the Philippines about 5 or 6 years ago, and I was giving a lecture very similar to this one, and afterwards an investigator came up to me and told me about a kind of disease that they were studying. They were studying this very rare neurological disease, and they had this potential new treatment, very new, very experimental, hadn't been given to very many people, might be helpful, but also could be very risky. And here's the challenge. You can give that drug and test it in people who can't give consent, but it poses low risk. So what the idea was in this case was this investigator had 2 populations. He had people who had very early disease hadn't progressed very far, and they were perfectly competent and able to understand. And he said to me, I could do the research in that group, but their brains are basically fully intact, and the risks of this study, of this drug, are cognitive effects. So there's great risks in that population because their brains are intact, and if this drug turns out to be harmful, it could harm their brains. but they can understand and give consent, and they can understand those risks. That's the first population. The second population is people who have advanced disease. They have advanced disease, and the condition has already largely done its damage to their brain. So their brains have already been damaged in this way, and as a result, the drug doesn't have as many risks to those people because they've already suffered most of the deficits that they're going to get. So even if the drug is risky, it's not going to hurt them much more than they've already been harmed. So everybody has this set up. So you've got this population can understand high risks. This population can't understand relatively low risks. And the question is, which group should you do it in? There's actually a historical example we could talk about for this one that's very interesting. But I'm going to give you the next one. Quiz question 3. This is when I said there should be a surrogate. There should be somebody, a legally authorized representative, who is the one who makes decisions for people like Ms. P, adults who can't understand or make their own decisions. And then the question is, who is an appropriate surrogate in this regard? And this is a very challenging question in the U.S. What the U.S. federal regulations say is you need a legally authorized representative. And then you say, okay, well, let's look at the regulations. Who's a legally authorized representative? The answer is, according to the federal regulations, is you look to state law. And state law determines who counts as a legally authorized representative. The problem is that typically state laws, or most states in the U.S., don't have laws with respect to research. So what you have to do then is you have to start looking at the laws with respect to surrogates for clinical care. And that raises some questions. To what extent is a clinical surrogate appropriate to enroll somebody in research? Almost every state, I think maybe, I'm not a lawyer, but I think maybe every state has a next of kin hierarchy. So if I don't fill out an advance directive, if I don't name a surrogate for myself, and I'm in a car accident, then there's the next of kin hierarchy. Somebody's chosen on that to make clinical care decisions for me. Is that an appropriate person to also make research decisions? Should we just leave it to the next of kin to make decisions for them? All right. That was quiz question 1, quiz question 2, and quiz question 3. We've got 6 minutes, which means I'm not going to let you guys out too early. So does somebody want to give me the answer so I can write up a paper on one of these 3? I don't have a clear answer to any of these questions. Quiz question 1, here's 1, prospect of benefit with people who can't consent. You enroll them or you exclude them. Quiz question 2, do you do the low risks, people who can't consent, or high risk, people who can consent? Or surrogates? Anybody have thoughts? Any of these are easier, harder, more interesting? Should I give you one more example? You tell me this is a mistake or not? So I'll talk about this one. This one's contentious because it ended up in court, and getting the facts isn't necessarily easy. I know people know the case of Jesse Gelsinger, who was an older teenager who enrolled in a study. And basically, at least on one description of the case, what was going on was there was an option. This was a gene transfer study, very early gene transfer study. And the option was they could do it. Again, it's all contentious. Who knows if this is right? One description, though, is could do the study in very young kids who couldn't understand it because they were very young. But because of their immune systems and their disease condition, the research would likely not be terribly risky for them, although it still would be risky. Or they could do it in older teenagers who, according to most data, can understand, but they would face much higher risks from it. So who do you do that study in? First, early gene transfer study. You can do it in 3-year-olds, can't possibly understand, but you can get the permission of their parents, relatively low risks. Or you do it in 19-year-olds who face much higher risks, but can agree to themselves, consent for themselves. All right, ready? Show of hands. Everybody's got the question? All right, who says you do it in the 3-year-olds? Can't understand, but risks, let's call them relatively low. All right? How about you do it in the 19-year-old? Higher risks, but they can understand, and they're making the decision for themselves. Nobody else is making the decision for them. So almost an even split. Somebody have an argument one way or the other, strong reason? All right, I'll try to repeat it so we get it into the mic. Yeah?
Are the
Yeah, benefits are equal. Both scientific, let's just imagine scientific benefits are equal. So the researcher will tell you, I'll learn as much from the 19-year-old as a 3-year-old in terms of whether this works and everything. And also to that person, similar benefits. Now, of course, there's a slight difference that a 3-year-old gets the benefits, they'll have them for longer in their life than a 19-year-old. I don't know if you want to take that into account. Any other questions? Any arguments? So who was on the 3-year-old side? Somebody want to give the argument for the 3-year-old side? Anybody? Anybody got to know? Why are you doing the 3-year-old? You don't care about informed consent?
No, it's just less risk.
So less risk. So the important thing is protecting the subject from being harmed. Yeah. And they have a surrogate, they have a parent. You figure hopefully the parent's pretty good decision maker for them.
And we have a lot of experience with leukemias and treatment like that where we didn't have done.
Yeah, okay. Are you guys convinced the ones who wanted the teenagers? Everybody? I think you guys have, I don't know, did they win or did they just cowed you guys into silence? Anybody want to argue for doing it with a teenager?
Yeah, it all sounds good, assuming that we know and we claim we know.
It all sounds good as long as we know what?
That all we claim is correct.
Yeah. Yeah. So good. So one of the things you might be worried about is this is research and, well, we think these are the risks and we think these are the potential benefits, but we never can be sure, right? And you might think to the extent that you're not sure, maybe it shouldn't be up to us. Maybe it shouldn't even be up to the parents, right? And maybe that's a reason for letting people can understand for themselves. I'm just going to leave everybody this one because why I think this one is so great, and I don't know the answer to this question, but I think what's crucial and what's fundamental about this, thinking about the ethics of clinical research, thinking about vulnerable subjects is, I think what it does is it presses on what I take to be two of the most important protections. Right? Informed consent is really important, and protecting people from risks and harm is really important. And what's challenging about this is it doesn't let you have both, right? It says, look, I'll give you informed consent or I'll give you low risks, but you don't get both. And then what you have to decide, or what we have to decide is, we have to decide which one we're going to go with. And I'll give you an argument on both sides quickly before we end. One is, you might think, and this is true with parents, we give parents a lot of leeway in making decisions for kids. Or you might think, in the case of Ms. P and Mr. P, they were married for 40 years. You might think, okay, it's somebody else, but it's somebody who really knows her and probably knows what she wants. Well, it turns out, unfortunately, that there's at least a fair amount of empirical data that we're not very good predictors of the preferences of other people, including people who are very close to us, people we've known for a really long time. So it's hard to know how much we can rely on other people. In the Jesse Gelsinger, so that's the consent worry about how much we rely on source. On the other hand, unfortunately, the Jesse Gelsinger, this actual case, Jesse Gelsinger died as a result of being in this study. Now, of course, that's not a clear reason why we should have done it 3-year-olds. Maybe the 3-year-olds would have died. We're never going to know that. But it shows that these are really challenging, important questions to try to think hard about and get right, and that people are faced with. Okay. All right. Any last thoughts, things I should have said, questions we should have answered? Yes?
So a lot of times when dealing with this topic, people discuss informed consent because it's one of the most important.
Yeah.
But I very rarely hear what the regulations are once somebody is enrolled, because it feels like all the protections are stacked up
Yep.
at the beginning of the study,
Right.
which makes perfect sense. But what happens with pregnant women, with children, with prisoners once they're in the study and approved? Are there still additional
Yeah.
protections over other subjects, or at that point is everybody equally considered?
Good. Great question. So as you say, as you point out here, most of the protections that we talked about are at the point of enrollment, or before enrollment, so IRB review, that happens before enrollment, and then at the point of enrollment, a surrogate or extra for Maki, it was an independent assessment of her voluntariness. So a lot of this goes on before a person is enrolled and starts in a study. So that's where I think typically most of the protections are. So your question is, but what about added protections as the study goes along? So there are protections for everybody as study goes along. So for instance, typically in the US, each study has to be re-reviewed at least once a year. You have to find out how things are going, whether or not anybody's been hurt, whether or not there's any information on risks. So there's ongoing evaluation of the study from the point of the IRB. Also, as it's always said, informed consent isn't just at the point of enrollment, it's ongoing. So somebody can always say no, somebody can always withdraw. That's true of a competent adult. For a child, it would be they could dissent. Or with Ms. P, they could say dissent. They enrolled, but a week later, they might want to say, I want to go home. So there's that protection. But that's also a protection that applies to competent adults as well. So typically, I would say that most of the protections for vulnerable subjects happen early on. What you could do, there are possibilities for added ones as a study goes along. So for instance, in the US, which I know the best, there's provisions for things like independent monitors. So what you could do is you could say, okay, we're worried about Ms. P. We're going to enroll her, but I'm going to have somebody check in on her once every couple of days just to make sure she's okay. There is a group actually called the Human Subjects Protection Unit that's run out of the clinical director of the Mental Health Institute here. That's a very novel way of doing that. And they do that for some studies where there are people who are identified as vulnerable. They are monitors, and they stay with the people throughout their participation in the study, and they check in on them every once in a while to make sure things are going okay. So that is one case where there's, I think, a valuable added protection for vulnerable subjects. So there's things like that you can do. I think, without having any good data on it, I think it's probably relatively rare that that happens. Although it's happening here in a number of studies. Anything else? All right, thank you.